Our top story tonight, the aid for trade debate, the growing controversy in Great Britain over whether British aid, £280 million of it, should be stopped to India, especially after a French company won the initial bid for a $15 billion deal for Indian Air Force fighter jets. Today, a British government delegation met with the Minister of State for Defence, Pallam Raju.
Stop aid to India. A growing clamour in Britain after India chose a French fighter jet over one made partly in the United Kingdom. Rattled by the rejection by India of the Eurofighter Typhoon jet, a high-level UK government delegation rushed to New Delhi and met Junior Defence Minister Pallam Raju today. But the sense in the government is UK cannot expect more trade for its aid.
Our is a liberated country. We are no more connected with UK. We do business. That one country cannot dictate and say that, you do business only with me, not anybody else.
But that's exactly the question being asked in Britain now. The British Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell had earlier said Britain's aid to Delhi was partly about seeking to sell Britain's Typhoon jets. After the French won India's biggest defence deal, the British press dug up Indian Finance Minister's comment from last August in the Rajya Sabha. We do not require the aid, it is a peanut in our total development exercises. So is aid a tool for diplomacy? The UK papers also reported that then Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao had proposed to stop taking any more aid from Britain. But its aid department, the DFID, said cancelling the programme would cause grave political embarrassment to Britain. The United Kingdom has given £1 billion to India in the last 5 years and is planning to spend a further £600 million on Indian aid by 2015. But critics in the UK point out that India now gives out more foreign aid than it receives, and India has a growth rate of nearly 7% compared to UK's 1%. But in a debate peppered by jingoistic views also comes a reality check. A third of the world's poorest people living in India and half its children malnourished. This, say advocates of aid, is the biggest argument for continued support to India.
The only political decision taken as far as this particular deal was concerned was in fact taking no political decision at all. In other words, the Air Force was given a completely free hand to make whatever call that it felt suitable. But given geopolitical tensions and building up trade relationships with two very, very important allies like the UK and France, should more thought have been given to it, particularly seeing the kind of furor that it has given rise to. In London, Kajari Sen for NDTV.
So as British taxpayers ask exactly where their money is going in India, and India, of course, the whole debate about why we should be projected as a poor country, especially with India now giving increasing aid to neighbouring countries and Africa, again for geopolitical reasons. Well, joining me tonight on that is the former Minister of State for External Affairs and Congress MP, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, also, of course, former UN Under Secretary General. I'm also joined by retired Air Vice Marshal Kapil Kak, thank you so much, and Andrew Bankum, Asia correspondent of The Independent, who, of course, been tracking the story very closely. Shashi Tharoor, when you see this whole current debate, it really points to a larger issue also of how India sees itself. Are we now, as a middle-income country as defined by the World Bank, as an emerged superpower as defined by President Obama a few years ago during his visit? Should we still be recipients of aid at all? And is it odd that we're now crying foul about British taxpayers making the point, why are we giving aid to a country which can which can buy jets for $15 billion?
Yeah, I personally think that we as a government should not be in the business of receiving aid anymore, for the simple reason that even the aid the British give, for example, is some 0.4%, less than half of 1% of our GDP, and we're not talking about sums of money that the government itself can't dispose of. But that's different from saying that Indians don't need aid. There are, as your report pointed out, a large number of very poor people in desperate conditions in our country. They still benefit from humanitarian aid of various sorts by Indian NGOs, by international NGOs, and occasionally by governments. And it seems to me that India's government probably can say, look, we can do without it, but India's poor probably need it. And we've got to find a way to reconcile those two. The way might well be to encourage countries abroad like Britain to give their assistance to respectable charities with a track record that can actually directly help poor people, rather than through the government, so that this whole debate about the government spending money in ways that it sees fit should not interfere with the aid decisions. In other words, when the government of India decides to buy a fighter jet, it should do so on the basis of purely national security considerations without having fingers pointed at it for spending so much money without showing enough appreciation for British aid.
No,
to me, British aid is something that goes to India's people. It is a result, by the way, of 200 years of the impoverishment of India's people by British colonialism. So there is a moral justification for Britain continuing to give it. And as far as I'm concerned, the two issues can and should be separated.
Right, they should be separate. An interesting debate, of course, whether India can afford to spend $15 billion, yet have such a large number of India's population malnourished. Should we look at the British government to come in, even if they provide it directly to states, and they have said they will change that. Let me bring in Lord Meghnad Desai, who joins us from London on that. Lord Desai, of course, from the Labour Party, and you've heard the huge controversy there as well after Andrew Mitchell, the Development Secretary, made the point that, well, our aid was in a way, partly we did hope that this deal would come through because of the aid we actually gave. What's your take on that, and do you feel that British taxpayers should continue funding aid to India?
Well, partly you have to see this as a quarrel within the coalition government. Aid is supposed to be the favorite of Liberal Democrats, and the Conservative Party, at least the right-wing Conservative Party, hates all forms of aid. So they are trying to get at the government through the idea of aid. Then obviously the fact that the British didn't succeed in getting the defense contract has hurt even more. So I think Andrew Mitchell, made a gaffe by saying, "Oh, we do give aid just to get defense contracts." Well, if that's the case, then they should stop giving aid, because this kind of aid for diplomatic reasons, which is not unknown, it's been done for a long time,
yes,
will no longer do when it comes to countries which are important in G20, like India. I think India obviously does not need the aid as such. It is, I think, a fraction of the fertilizer subsidy we give. I think it's 1/4 of the fertilizer subsidy we give away. So I think the only question is, India doesn't need the aid. If the British want to give aid, they should not link it with any contracts. And secondly, they should give, as Shashi was saying just now, to private charities or NGOs, rather than, it should not be a government-to-government aid.
Well, that's ironic. The Indian government doesn't need aid, its people do. But let me bring in Air Vice Marshal Kapil Kark for a completely different reasoning. The kind of pressure, the diplomatic pressure put by countries on defense deals. It's such a huge business. What is the kind of pressure that goes into this? We've seen that a British government delegation has met the Minister of State for Defense, Pallam Raju, as well today on that. What are the geopolitical concerns which go into defense deals?
I think in the past, geopolitical, geostrategic factors were important considerations. But the defense procurement policies which have been enunciated over the years, and there's always, every year, there is an update of that.
It's been virtually stalled for the last decade.
Interesting point is that in this particular deal involving the combat fighters, there are no geostrategic and geopolitical considerations at all, as per the document which enshrines or anchor, in which this can be anchored. Because if you have geostrategic and geopolitical considerations, then you have a foreign military sales route, as we did with the Americans on the C-17 and the C-130. There was no open bids for that. But I think here, Sonia, I want to suggest that this is a kind of a trilogy. You have optics of the public who felt unease in terms of India getting this aid. That turned to dismay because of the deal not having come through. And the media, of course, shaped the whole narrative. Governmental level, this has been extremely well handled, except for Andrew Mitchell, as Lord Meghnad has said. But I think the bigger thing is of scales. And I think viewers need to understand the scales. India is UK's third largest investor. There has been a 45% increase in trade in just 1 year until October 2011. India is the largest market for exports of the UK, other than, of course, the EU. So when you see those large volumes, there's $24 billion dollar trade expected in 3 years' time. What is 280 million?
No,
I mean,
exactly.
It's laughable.
And what do they expect in return? Do they expect $15 billion as Indians are appointed? Let me just go across to Alpesh Patel of the Indo-UK Business Council, who joins me via Skype. Mr. Patel of the Indo-UK Business Council. The figures just pointed out there by Air Vice Marshal Kapil Kark, in a way it seems an identity crisis. Is Britain, the story reported by the English media over this weekend, picking up what Pranab Mukherjee said last year, that basically the aid you give us is peanuts. The Nirupama Rao actually had wanted to end this aid because she felt that the British board behind this was actually selling this image of India as a poor country, and it was kept on because of embarrassment to British politicians. What's your take on this as a member of the Indo-UK Business Council, who of course sees all these trade figures and the fact that Indian businesses are investing in the UK and Indian economy is much more robust than the British economy at the moment?
Let's be absolutely clear that 50% of children under the age of 5 in India are malnourished, as the Indian Prime Minister himself puts quite clearly a couple of weeks ago. Now, the arguments you've made about the quantity of aid given in relation to India's GDP or in relation to bilateral trade is an argument for more aid, not less of it. It's actually an argument for even more trade between the two countries, but until that can happen, if the aid goes directly to a third of the world's poor who reside within India's borders, then all the better for it. This should not be seen as an issue about national pride any more than that India needs to redouble its efforts to eliminate these problems. And the point Shashi Tharoor made, I don't think this aid is given as some kind of reparation for past colonial rule over India. I believe it's given as part of a broader strategy that the United Kingdom has to fulfill its Millennium Development Goals, and the fact, as I say, that vast majorities of people within India live on $1 a day.
So those. And let me bring in Andrew Bunkum here, because in fact you tweeted also a short while ago about the fact that 4 times as many UK voters think that aid to India should actually be stopped. And again, for a change, the Indian media has not been criticized, but the English media has really taken this story as almost an insult to their national pride, given the current whole British-French rivalry as well.
A couple of things. Loath as I am to speak on behalf of the British government, I think they would argue very strongly that there is no quid pro quo between aid and any sort of defence deal. I think what Mr Mitchell said was that he believed that aid was part of a broader relationship that the government was trying to build with India, that David Cameron had set out very clearly, and I think that's quite honest of him. I think it would be naive of us to assume that any sort of aid stands alone. India has an aid program in Afghanistan building roads. Are we to assume that India is only interested in building roads in India, in Afghanistan? It has a line of credit to Burma. Is it really interested in giving credit purely to helping the Burmese economy? Or does India want to have leverage in Afghanistan in the years to come? Does it want to have influence over China's influence in Burma? So I think that's in its broadest. The point you made about the British media, there has been a backlash, of course, especially within on the right of the British media, who have seized on this. They've seized on Pranab Mukherjee's comments from 2 years ago and kind of gouged them up again. I mean, here in India, when I go out reporting, and I have not covered any of the actual projects that the British government's funded, I have covered some of the projects on the ground that international charities have covered. The only people for whom this isn't controversial are those who benefit from it. It's the people whose lives are changed by the aid projects, be it education, be it health. Those people don't care where the money comes from. They're just delighted that they get it.
And that's an important point. But Shashi Tharoor, if I could bring you in here, the whole use of aid almost as a diplomatic weapon, the point Andrew Bunkum just made about Indian aid in Afghanistan. We've seen Indian inroads into Africa as well, where the whole China-India battle to gain control, as some would say, of the developing economies of Africa as well. Is that just a fact of international diplomacy?
Well, look, and there is obviously a certain element of that, but I would accept the argument that it's much more to do with the broader relationship. When India gives aid to African countries, it's part of a long history of solidarity with the African people, including during their anti-colonial struggles. And it's a way of actually tangibly adding to our expressions of support for them by giving them either loans or, in some cases, grants that enable them to benefit from Indian expertise as well as Indian resources. And we hope, obviously, that in a broad sense, that predisposes the recipients towards us. But we would never expect that we would necessarily see a quid pro quo on other decisions. And we think that a country like Britain, looking at India, should never assume that India would make a national security decision of such magnitude on the basis of anything other than national security considerations. But I'm sure Andrew Buncombe is right when he says that nobody seriously in the British government expected to see it that way. Aid is one arrow in the quiver of diplomacy, but it should not be seen in terms of a crude cause and effect relationship. And certainly between India and Britain, and indeed India as a whole, I don't think the aid is, in governmental sense, in terms of our overall budget and our overall resources, ever going to be important enough to influence any significant decision. So that's why I said let's not think of it as aid to the government, but aid to the Indian people directly as much as possible.
Let me ask you, both you and Lord Meghnad Desai on this. Lord Meghnad Desai, are we perhaps approaching the debate from the wrong perspective? Should we look perhaps at the fact that a country which is a nuclear power, a country which can afford $15 billion for fighter jets, important as they may be, still has the world's largest number of malnourished children? Do you think that within the Indian government there needs to be some reorganizing of priorities as well? The defense industry, of course, the defense establishment has said for years that this has stalled defense deals, but what's your take on this as an observer?
No, absolutely. When I was saying that the British aid to India was a fraction of the fertilizer subsidy India gives to the rich farmers, it tells you where the priorities are. If there are malnourished children in India, if there are people below the poverty line, it is basically the priorities the government of India, of all parties, has had for the last 61 years. It's more to do with nuclear power, defense, a big national posture, rather than reaching out genuinely to get people out of poverty. I mean, in that respect, British aid to India is a critique of how bad India is at meeting its own priorities. But then it is not a lack of money which is causing this thing. It is a priority. I mean, we are buying many more jets, which would easily solve the problem. But let's buy jets. I don't mind about buying jets, but let us spare some money to tackle malnourishment of children and poverty, and I'm sure India has the resources to do it. It's just wrong priorities.
Air Vice Marshal Kirk, wrong priorities, because I know the defense establishment has said that they've been getting the raw end of the deal because of this and losing out vis-a-vis China because of this.
No, absolutely. I think to say that, well, let India buy combat jets is very charitable, but I think we mustn't skew this debate with defense versus development. I think India's primary national strategic driver is the socio-economic growth and development of our people. On that, there is no two opinions. The question is, defense is there, and India is the lowest defense spender in the world at 1.8% of GDP against an average of about 2.5%.
The same in health and social security.
Absolutely. So the point I'm trying to make is, let it not be defense versus development. If you want to ensure unhindered development without any inimical forces trying to disrupt it, we have seen that in the past 4 wars have been fought, you will have to spend adequately. But I agree entirely on the fact that there has to be a balance. But aid as an instrumentality to alter the dynamics of what should be purely a national security and defense dynamic is, I think, completely uncalled for. Some of the views that have emanated from UK are, to say the least, irresponsible.
Shashi Tharoor, has the UPA government failed in its priorities, or is it trying to give too much to too many? We've seen various ambitious social welfare schemes, subsidy schemes announced one after the other, but the whole growth rate we boast about compared to Great Britain, eventually, where is all this money going to come from?
Well, look, that's exactly the policy of the UPA government, is to help the economy to grow so that the revenues generated by growth can be distributed fairly in order to pull up the underprivileged. You know, there should not be this false argument between human security and national security, which is the argument of the defense versus development people, the classic economic trade-off between guns and butter. The fact is, we need human security for our own people's sake. We have to do everything we can to prevent malnutrition, to pull people out of poverty, and so on, all of which our government is committed to. But frankly, if you don't have national security, how are you going to be able to provide human security according to your own lights and on your own terms? You would simply be the victim of anybody who's militarily stronger than you and can push you around. So governments have to do both. And our government is seriously committed both to national security, protecting the nation, ensuring the security of the Indian people in that sense,
Lord
but
Meghna,
also human security in terms of promoting the
disagrees with you on that point. You want to come in, Lord Meghna, this side. Go ahead.
Listen, nobody is objecting to national security spending. I pointed out about fertilizer subsidy and water subsidy and power subsidy, money which is going to rich farmers, thanks to the government of India's wrong priorities, rather than going to the poor and the malnourished. So it is not a question we shouldn't spend money on national security. No, let's spend all the money on national security, but let us get the priorities so that we spend more on health, more on nutrition, rather than on subsidy to petrol, to fertilizer, to power, to water, all those things. It is the rich getting subsidies in India which is the problem, and not national security.
In fact, Alpesh Patel, if you could come in here, sorry, your connection is bad on Skype, but if you could come in here, the point, one, I think, comparison which has aroused a great deal of outrage in Britain is the pointing of the fact that India has more Forbes billionaires than Great Britain currently does.
Well, wealth in one extreme is not really the concern here. What actually is the concern is the national shame that India, of children under the age of 5, 50% of them are malnourished. And there is one simple answer and reason why that is the case, because there is a lack of political will to do anything about it. The Prime Minister has called it a national shame. Not me, not the British government. The Prime Minister of India has called it a national shame. And to say on one side, well, this is a priority of the current government to ensure this is reduced. No, simply what the government has to do is to say that before the decade is out, they will reduce that figure by a fraction of tenfold. So there will be less than 5% who are malnourished. But there is a lack of political will because children under 5 don't vote.
Lack of political will because children below 5 can't vote. Shashi Tharoor, that often welfare schemes, subsidy schemes, rich subsidies, as Lord Meghna this pointed out, is aimed at the voting public. What happens to those who can't vote and don't have a voice?
Look, first of all, this is not accurate. The fact is that, first of all, a lot of the subsidies that my dear friend Meghna has been talking about are subsidies that are intended to ensure that our agricultural production is of an adequate level so that we can actually feed those in our country who are otherwise going to go hungry. That's the first point. The second point, in any case, is that when you speak in terms of malnourished young children, we are trying through the other kinds of distributive social justice programs. To give you one example, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has ensured that at least one member of every poor family in our villages gets 100 days of paid employment. Once they have that money in their pockets, they're able to feed their children. It's as simple as that. We're trying to tackle poverty and underdevelopment across the board. And I don't think it can be reduced very simply to sound bites.
Right, well,
or for that matter, arbitrary statistical targets.
Right, I'm going to come, Lord, I'll come back to you right now. I want to get Andrew Bunkum's view in here on that. When we hear this kind of debate, the issue of political will, how Indian politicians are addressing it, how is this going to actually, how do you actually feel this whole defence deal going to France, is it going to impact Indo-UK relations at all? We've seen a British government delegation coming here. Are we going to see more high-level pressure? Because clearly at the moment, the French companies only won the initial bid. It still has to be cleared by the Cabinet Committee of Security. Some points raised about the fact that the French company was actually ruled out in the initial bid, and then it was when President Sarkozy's intervention that it came back into the running at all. Do you see the whole political ante being upped in the next few weeks?
I'm sure the Air Marshal knows better than me, but I think when this decision came out last week, the British government was very disappointed. I think it had been very hopeful that the deal was going to come to the Eurofighter.
Why is it so important for the British economy? Why was this deal so key for
Well,
the
it's one of 4 countries that are involved in producing this aircraft. You know, it's a big deal. The British economy is not booming. A deal like this is obviously going to have a big impact. But I mean, you know, does it mean that they can't come in at a later stage? I mean, you'll know that defence deals don't always go very smoothly. I imagine the British government are hoping now that if they
that this may not go as smoothly as the initial round, and there's lots more the political manoeuvring in there. But that point there about
but I mean, sorry, yes. Just to sort of your other point, how is this going to impact the relationship? I mean, you were saying earlier, trade already went up 40% last year. India's the 3rd biggest investor. The relationship between India and the UK is far bigger than this one single deal. So I mean, you know, if it doesn't come through, well, so be it. But I mean, the relationship's going to remain, I'm sure.
If you would come in here, Air Marshal Kak, this whole point, because we know President Sarkozy's intervention actually got the French company through when it was initially ruled out on some technicality. Yeah. How much do presidents actually matter? How much does top-level political contact actually matter in a case like this? If, the U.S., of course, well known for the lobbying that is done by the president and top senators for U.S. companies.
Sonia, first and foremost, President Sarkozy made no difference at all to the selection of this platform. I think an interesting development which you may like to make a note of is that Mr. Antony's Brazilian counterpart, he's chatting with him today.
Really?
And Brazil is going to have a replacement for its combat aircraft, and the contenders are F-18 and, interestingly, Rafale again. So there are some cross-sectoral aspects here, but it was, I think, I can say very
This is the Rafale's first sale outside France.
Absolutely. Not only that, if this aircraft wasn't sold to India, Dassault and the French aerospace industry would collapse.
Some have described it as France's white elephant, but some have described it as France's white elephant. So interesting that India is getting that white elephant now.
But Sonia, the more critical point is, I think the world will have to get used to these disjunctions. As India grows at 8 to 9%, its defense needs will increase. You will see more and more a problem of optics as they see India as the largest economy in less than 20 years from today. So
that's an interesting
point. For
a
colonial mindset to accept this inevitable of history is a difficult proposition. That's why you see this. Americans got used to their losing 2 platforms. Don't forget, Americans gave India, I think, this last century's most amazing deal, or this century's in fact, the Indo-US nuclear cooperation. I mean, exceptionalized India in the nuclear order, which would have never happened.
India is part of the nuclear high table of the world. In fact,
and yet we rejected the 2 platforms.
In fact, Lord Meghnad Desai come in there that you have to dig them perhaps for Air Marshal Kak and get over the colonial mindset. India is setting its own rules of the game, and peanuts, as Pranab Mukherjee described it 2 years ago, of aid doesn't really impact it. Do you think it is an image perception, or do you think within India as well we need to decide whether we see ourselves as a superpower or a country which has serious social issues of health, education, malnutrition?
I think it's both ways. You know, the British are very complacent about the relations with India. They think India is in the pocket and India will always come out on their side because of Commonwealth and all that. They have to realize that selling things to India is a competitive business. India at the same time should not feel too sensitive about what the British do or do not do about India. India is a large economy, it's a strong economy, and while I do think that India wastes money on subsidies, and I don't agree with what Shashi said about agriculture, the point is that India is now a part of the G20, it's a very powerful country, it can do what it likes, and it should stop worrying about what the British press says. British press is neither here nor there.
Well,
countries like UK and France have saddled themselves with armament industries, which are very expensive and don't generate that much employment, but they're an important part of the economy.
Well,
I would look forward to the day when nobody has to buy armaments, but that's another story.
Well, worrying on British press or British politicians, let's see how this story unfolds. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. Shashi Tharoor, Alpesh Patel, Air Marshal Kak, Meghnad Desai and Andrew Pankum. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Let's move to the other story which viewers have been interested in, viewers have been writing in about, and messages of support coming from across India and the world. That's, of course,